All right. Chapter 24. Chapter 24. Chapter 2, page 24. I spent the last afternoon of before constructing a 1 to 10,000 scale replica of the Empire State Building from boxes of adult diapers. It was a thing of beauty, really, spanning 5 feet at its base and towering above a cosmetics aisle, with jumbos for the foundation, lights for the observation deck, and meticulously stacked trial sizes for its iconic spire. It was almost perfect, minus one crucial detail. You use never leak, Shelley said, eyeing my craftsmanship with a skeptical frown. The sale is on stay tight. Shelley was the store's manager. Her slumped shoulders and dour expression were as much a part of our uniform as the blue polo shirts we all had to wear. I thought you said never leak, I said, because she had. Stay tight, she insisted, shaking her head regretfully, as if my tower were a crippled racehorse and she were the bearer of a pearl-handled pistol. There was a brief but awkward silence in which she continued to shake her head and shift her eyes from me to the tower and then back to me again. I stared blankly at her as if completely failing to grasp what she was passive-aggressively implying. Oh, I said finally. You mean you want me to do it over? It's just, you use never leak, she repeated. No problem, I'll get started right away. With the toe of my regulation black sneaker, I nudged a single box from the tower's foundation. In an instant, the whole magnificent structure was cascading down around us, sending a tidal wave of diapers crashing across the floor, boxes caroming off the legs of startled customers, skidding as far as the automatic door, which slid open, letting in a rush of August heat. Shelley's face turned the color of a ripe pomegranate. She should have fired me on the spot, but I knew that I'd never be so lucky. I'd been trying to get fired from Smart Aid all summer, and it had proved next to impossible. I came in late, repeatedly, and with the flimsiest of excuses, made shockingly incorrect change, even misshelved things on purpose, stocking lotions among laxatives and birth control next to baby shampoo. Rarely had I worked so hard at anything, and yet no matter how incompetent I pretended to be, Shelley stubbornly kept me on the payroll. Let me qualify my previous statement. It was next impossible for me to get fired from Smart Aid. Any other employee would have been out of the door a dozen minor infractions ago. It was my lesson in politics. There were 3 Smart Aids in Inglewood, the small settlement beach in which I lived, and 27 in Sarasota County, and 115 in all of Florida, spreading across the state like some untreatable rash. The reason I couldn't be fired was that my uncles owned every single one of them. The reason I couldn't quit was that working for Smart Aid as your first job had been a long hallowed family tradition. All of my campaign of self-sabotage had earned me was an unwinnable feud with Shelley and the deep and abiding resentment of my coworkers, who, let's face it, were going to resent me anyway because no matter how much displays I knocked over or customers that I shortchanged, one day I was going to inherit a sizable chunk of the company, and they were not. Wading through the diapers, Shelley poked her finger into my chest and was about to say something dour when the PA system interrupted her. Jacob, you have a call in line 2. Jacob, line 2. She glared at me as I backed away, leaving her pomegranate face amid the ruins of my tower. The employee lounge was a dank, windowless room where I found the pharmacy assistant, Linda, nibbling a crustless sandwich and a vivid glow of the soda machine. She nodded at a phone screwed to the wall. Line 2's for you. Whoever it is sounded freaked. I picked up the dangling receiver. Jacob, is that you? Hi, Grandpa Portman. Jacob, thank God I need my key. Where's my key? He sounded upset, out of breath. What key? Don't play games, he snapped. You know what key. You probably just misplaced it. Your father put you up to this, he said. Just tell me. He doesn't have to know. Nobody put me up to anything. I tried to change the subject. Did you take your pills this morning? They were coming for me, you understand? I don't know how they found me after all these years, but they did. What am I supposed to fight them with? A gosh darn butter knife? It wasn't the first time I'd heard him talk like this. My grandfather was getting old, and frankly, he was starting to lose it. The signs of his mental decline had been subtle at first, like forgetting to buy groceries or calling my mother by my aunt's name. But over the summer, his encroaching dementia had taken a cruel twist. The fantastic stories he'd invented about his life during the war, the monsters, The enchanted island had become completely oppressively real to him. He'd been especially agitated the last few weeks, and my parents, who feared he was becoming a danger to himself, were seriously considering putting him in a home. For some reason, I was the only one who received these apocalyptic phone calls from him. As usual, I did my best to calm him down. "You're safe. Everything's fine. I'll bring over a video for us to watch later. How's that sound?" "No, stay where you are. It's not safe here." "Grandpa, the monsters aren't coming for you. You killed them all in the war, remember?" I turned to face the wall, trying to hide my end of this bizarre conversation from Linda, who shot me serious glances while pretending to read a fashion magazine. "Not all of them," he said. "No, no, no. I killed a lot, sure, but there are always more." I could hear him banging around his house, opening drawers, slamming things. He was in a full meltdown. "You stay away, hear me? I'll be fine. Cut out their tongues and stab 'em in the eyes. That's all you gotta do. If I could just find the gosh darn key!" The key in question opened a giant locker in Grandpa Portman's garage. Inside was a stockpile of guns and knives, sufficient to arm a small militia. He'd spent half his life collecting them, traveling to out-of-state gun shows, going on long hunting trips, and dragging his reluctant family to rifle ranges on sunny Sundays so that they could learn to shoot. He loved his guns so much that sometimes he even slept with them. My dad had an old snapshot to prove it. Grandpa Portman napping with pistol in hand. When I asked my dad why Grandpa was so crazy about guns, he said it sometimes happened to people who used to be soldiers or who had experienced traumatic things. I guess that after everything my grandfather had been through, he never really felt safe anywhere, not even at home. The irony was, now that delusions and paranoia were starting to get the best of him, it was true. He wasn't safe at home, not with all these guns around. That's why my dad had swiped the key. I repeated the lie that I didn't know where it was. There was more swearing and banging as Grandpa Portman stomped around looking for it. "Ha," he said finally. "Let your father have the key if it's so important to him. Let him have my dead body, too." I got off the phone as politely as I could and then called my dad. "Grandpa's flipping out," I told him. "Has he taken his pills today?" "He won't tell me. Doesn't sound like it, though." I heard my dad sigh. "Can you stop by and make sure he's okay? I can't get off work right now." And my dad volunteered part-time at a bird rescue, where he helped rehabilitate snowy egrets hit by cars and pelicans who had swallowed fishhooks. He was an amateur ornithologist, that's a bird researcher, and a wannabe nature writer, with a stack of unpublished manuscripts to prove it, which were all real jobs only if you happen to be married to a woman whose family owns 115 drugstores. Of course, mine wasn't the realest of jobs either, and it was easy to ditch whenever I felt like it. I said I would go. "Thanks, Jake. I promise we'll get all this grandpa stuff sorted out soon, okay?" "All this grandpa stuff. You mean put him in a home," I said. "Make him someone else's problem." "Mom and I haven't decided yet." "Of course you have, Jacob. I can handle him, Dad, really. Maybe now you can, but he's only going to get worse." "Fine, whatever." Now we meet Ricky, who is hands down one of the best characters in the whole book. I hung up and called my friend Ricky for a ride. 10 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable throaty honk of his ancient Crown Victoria in the parking lot. On my way out, I broke the bad news to Shelley. Her tower of stay tight would have to wait until tomorrow. "Family emergency," I explained. "Right," she said. I emerged into the sticky hot evening to find Ricky smoking on the hood of his battered car. Something about his mud-encrusted boots and the way that he let smoke curl from his lips and how the sinking sun lit his green hair remind me of a punk redneck James Dean. He was all of those things, a bizarre cross-pollination of subcultures possible only in South Florida. They say only in South Florida, but I feel like this describes kids here pretty well too. So
I've seen 50 people with blue hair today.
yeah. He saw me and leapt off the hood. "You fired yet?" he shouted across the parking lot. "Shh," I hissed, running towards him. "They don't know my plan." I guarantee they do. Ricky punched my shoulder in a manner meant to be encouraging, but that nearly snapped my rotator cuff. "Don't worry, special ed. There's always tomorrow." He called me special ed because I was in a few gifted classes, which were, technically speaking, part of our school's special education curriculum. a subtlety of nomenclature that Ricky found endlessly amusing. That was our friendship, equal parts irritation and cooperation. The cooperation part was an unofficial brains for brawn trade agreement that we'd worked out, in which I helped him not fail English, and he helped me not get killed by roided out sociopaths who prowled the halls of our school. That he made my parents deeply uncomfortable was merely a bonus. He was, I suppose, my best friend, which is a less pathetic way of saying he was my only friend. When I imagine Jacob, I imagine like someone about the size of Davion, like just tiny, tiny. And then when I imagine Ricky, well, they describe Ricky as 6'5", and so I imagine them to be quite a pair. Ricky kicked the Crown Vic's passenger door, which was how you opened it, and I climbed in. The Vic was amazing, the museum-worthy piece of unintentional folk art. Ricky brought it from the town dump with a jar of quarters, or so he claimed. A pedigree whose odor even the forest of air freshener trees he'd hung from the mirror couldn't mask. The seats were armored with duct tape so that the errant upholstery springs wouldn't find their way up your ass. Best of all was the exterior, a rusted moonscape of holes and dents, the result of a plan to earn extra gas money by allowing drunken partygoers to whack the car with a golf club for a buck a swing. The only rule, which had not been rigorously enforced, was that you couldn't aim at anything made of glass. The engine rattled to life in a cloud of blue smoke. As we left the parking lot and rolled past strip malls towards Grandpa Portman's house, I began to worry about what we might find when we got there. Worst-case scenarios included my grandfather running naked in the street, wielding a hunting rifle, foaming at the mouth in the front lawn, or lying in wait with a blunt object in hand. Anything was possible, and that this would be Ricky's first impression of a man I'd spoken about with reverence made me especially nervous. Can anybody, poor Candy, tell me what the word reverence means?
So, caution,
Not caution. Good guess, though.
seriousness,
Reverence sounds like reverend. So using those two connections, what might reverence mean? Josh, you sit up, please. Reverend.
I want to say serious.
Huh?
It's word.
He is embarrassed to introduce Ricky to him in this state when he's talked so highly about him. That was a good guess, though. Reverence means like with like high honor. He really respects his grandfather, and he's spoken very highly of him and very lovingly. And his grandfather's a really important person in his life, and he's told all of this to Ricky. And now the first time Ricky's going to meet Grandpa is when he's like gone off the rails, bonkers, which he is not excited about. Nate, sit up, please. The sky was turning the color of a fresh bruise as we pulled into my grandfather's subdivision, a bewildering labyrinth of interlocking cul-de-sacs known collectively as Circle Village. We stopped at the guard gate to announce ourselves, but the old man in the booth was snoring and the gate was open, as often was the case. So we drove in. My phone chirped with a text from my dad asking how things were going, and in the short time it took me to respond, Ricky managed to get us completely and stunningly lost. When I said I had no idea where we were, he cursed and pulled a succession of squealing U-turns, spitting arcs of tobacco juice from his window. As I scanned the neighborhood for a familiar landmark. Take the pass. It wasn't easy, even though I'd been to visit my grandfather countless times growing up, because each house looked like the next, squat and boxy with minor variations, trimmed with aluminum siding or dark 70s wood, or fronted by plaster colonnades that seemed almost delusionally aspirational. Street signs, half of which had turned blank and blistered white from sun exposure, were little help. The only real landmarks were bizarre, colorful lawn ornaments, of which Circle Village was a veritable open-air museum. Finally, I recognized a mailbox that was held aloft by a metal butler that, despite his straight back and snooty expression, appeared to be crying tears of rust. I shouted at Ricky to turn left. The Vic's tire screeched, and I was flung against the passenger door. The impact must have jarred something loose in my brain, because suddenly directions came rushing back to me. Right at the flamingo orgy, left at the multi-ethnic roof Santas, straight past the pissing cherubs. As we passed the cherubs, Ricky slowed into a crawl and peered doubtfully down my grandfather's block. There's not a single porch light on, not a glowing TV behind a window, not a town car in a carport. All the neighbors had fled north to escape the punishing summer heat, leaving yard gnomes to drown in lawns gone wild and hurricane shutters shut tight, so that each house looked like a little pastel bomb shelter. Last one on the left, I said. Ricky tapped the accelerator and we started down the street. At the fourth or fifth house, we passed an old man watering his lawn. He was bald as an egg and stood in a bathrobe and slippers, spraying the ankle-high grass. The house was dark and shuttered like the rest. I turned to look, but he seemed to stare back, though he couldn't have, I realized with a small shock, because his eyes were perfectly milky white. That's strange, I thought. Grandpa Portman has never mentioned that one of his neighbors was blind. I want you to take one of your little Post-its that's near your desk and mark page 32. This bit that we just read about the block being like closed up, grass is grown up, the hurricane shutters are shut, and then this neighbor that's like this blind neighbor out watering the lawn. This is foreshadowing. We don't know it yet, but it's foreshadowing. It's going to come into play when we get towards the end of the book. And we'll come back and visit it. 32. The street ended at a wall of scrub pines, and Ricky hung a sharp left into my grandfather's driveway. He cut the engine, got out, and kicked my door open. Our shoes hushed through the dry grass to the porch. I rang the bell and waited. A dog barked somewhere, a lonely sound in the muggy evening. When there was no answer, I banged on the door, thinking maybe the bell had stopped working. Ricky swatted at the gnats that had begun to clothe us. Maybe he stepped out, Ricky said, grinning. Hot date. Go ahead and laugh, I said. He's got a better shot than we do any night of the week. This place is crawling with eligible widows. I joked, only to calm my nerves. The quiet made me anxious. Hey. You need a band? Yes. I think both are in that bag right there. While I'm doing this, what do you think of Ricky so far? What are your opinions of Ricky?
He seems alright, yeah.
He seems alright.
He's alright.
Miss King, let me just stay here. Mr. Smith thinks I'm in Beta Club. It's okay.
No, I'm
We got an
recording.
excuse.
I'm recording, and that's not an excuse. You're not going to hang out in here. If you're not going to Beta, you go back to Smith. Thank you. You're welcome.
Mr. Smith.
Is a wonderful teacher.
He is a wonderful teacher. He's a wonderful person. I don't play for him.
Okay, where were we? No. Oh. I fetched the extra key from its hiding place in the bushes. Wait here. Hell I am. Why? Because you're 6'5" and have green hair, and my grandfather doesn't know you and owns lots of guns. Ricky shrugged and stuck another wad of tobacco in his cheek, so he is both chewing tobacco and smoking at the same time. Special. He went to stretch himself out on the lawn chair as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Even in the fading light, I could tell the house was a disaster. It looked like it had been ransacked by thieves. Bookshelves and cabinets had been emptied. The knickknacks and large print Reader's Digest that had filled them were thrown across the floor. Couch cushions and chairs were overturned. The fridge and the freezer doors hung open, their contents melting into sticky puddles in the linoleum. So here's my next question. If the doors are open and everything's melting into puddles, has it been a short time or a long time since they were flung open?
It's been about 2 or 3 hours.
It's been a long time. So way before Grandpa Portman called Jacob, they got flung open. So something happened long before he called him. So calling him was absolutely a last resort. My heart sank. Grandpa Portman had really finally lost his mind. I called his name, but heard nothing. I went from room to room, turning on lights, looking for anywhere a paranoid old man might hide from monsters. Behind furniture in the attic crawl space, under a workbench in the garage. I even looked behind his weapons cabinet, though of course it was locked. The handle ringed by scratches where he tried to pick it. Out on the lanai, that was a covered porch, we talked about that, a gallows of unwanted ferns swung browning in the breeze. While on my knees on the astroturf's floor, I peered beneath rattan benches, afraid of what I might discover. I saw a gleam of light in the backyard. Running through the screen door, I found a flashlight abandoned in the grass. Its beam pointed in the woods in the woods that edged my grandfather's yard. A scrubby wilderness of sawtooth pimentos and trash palms that ran a mile between the Circle Village and the next subdivision, Century Woods. According to local legend, the woods were crawling with snakes, raccoons, and wild boars. When I pictured my grandfather out there, lost and raving in nothing but his bathrobe, a black feeling welled up in me. Every other week, there was a news story about some geriatric citizen tripping into a retention pond and being devoured by alligators. The worst-case scenario wasn't hard to imagine. I shouted for Ricky, and a moment later, he come tearing around the side of the house. Right away, he noticed something I hadn't. A long, mean-looking slice in the screen door. He let out a low whistle. That's a hell of a cut. Wild pig could have done it, or bobcat maybe. You should see the claws on those things. A peal of savage barking broke out nearby. We both started and then traded a nervous glance. Or a dog, I said. The sound triggered a chain reaction across the neighborhood, and soon barks were coming from every direction. Could be, Ricky said, nodding. I got a 22 in my trunk. You just wait. And he walked off to retrieve it. So Jacob's 15, and it says that he helps Ricky pass English class. So more than likely, they're in the same grade. So Ricky might be 16. And Ricky not only smokes and chews tobacco, he also has a 22 in his trunk, which, if you don't know, is illegal to have until you're like 18 or 21, depending on the state. So Ricky is just a hot mess, and he's just the best character ever. I love a good character that's like just a hot mess all the time. Barks faded, and a chorus of night insects rose up in their place, drowning an alien. Sweat trickled down my face. It was dark now, but the breeze had died, and somehow the air seemed hotter than it had all day. I picked up a flashlight and stepped across the trees. My grandfather was out there somewhere, I was sure of it. But where? I was no tracker, and neither was Ricky, but yet something seemed to guide me anyway. A quickening in the chest. A whisper in the vicious air, and suddenly I couldn't wait another second. I tromped into the underbrush like a bloodhound scenting an invisible trail. It's hard to run in Florida woods, where every square foot not occupied by trees is bristling with thigh-high pimento spears and nets of entangling skunk vine, but I did my best, calling my grandfather's name and sweeping my flashlight everywhere. I caught a white glimpse out of the corner of my eye, and I made a beeline for it, but upon closer inspection, it turned out to be just a bleached and deflated soccer ball I'd lost years before. I was about to give up and go back to Ricky when I spied a narrow corridor of freshly stomped pimentos not far away. I stepped into it and shone my light around. The leaves were splattered with something dark. My throat went dry. Steeling myself, I began to follow the trail, and the farther I went, the more my stomach knotted, as though my body knew what lay ahead and was trying to warn me. And then the trail of the flattened brush widened out, and I saw him. My grandfather lay face down in a bed of creeper, his legs sprawled out and one arm twisted beneath him as if he'd fallen from a great height. I thought surely he was dead. His undershirt was soaked with blood, His pants were torn, and one shoe was missing. For a long moment, I just stared, the beam of my flashlight shivering across his body. When I could breathe again, I said his name, but he didn't move. I sank to my knees and pressed the flat of my hand against his back. The blood that soaked through was still warm. I could feel him breathing ever so shallowly. I slid my arms under him and rolled him to his back. He was alive, though just barely. His eyes glassy, his face sunken and white. Then I saw the gashes across his midsection and nearly fainted. They were wide and deep and clotted with soil, and the ground where he'd lain was muddy from blood. I tried to pull the rags of his shirt over his wounds without looking at them. I heard Ricky shout from the backyard. "I'm here," I screamed, but maybe I should have said more, like danger or blood, but I couldn't form the words. All I could think was that grandfathers were supposed to die in beds, in hushed places humming with machines, not in heaps on the sodden, reeking ground, with ants marching over them, a brass letter opener clutched in one trembling hand. A letter opener. That's all he had to defend himself. I slid it from his finger, and he grasped helplessly at the air. So I took his hand and held it, my nail-bitten fingers twined with his pale, webbed purple veins. "I have to move you," I told him, sliding one arm under his back and the other under his legs. I began to lift, but he moaned and went rigid, so I stopped. I couldn't bear to hurt him. I couldn't leave either, so there was nothing to do but wait. So I gently brushed loose soil from his arms and face and thinning white hair. Yeah, we take the pass. That's when I noticed his lips moving. His voice was barely audible, something less than a whisper. I leaned down and put my ear to his lips. He was mumbling, fading in and out of lucidity, shifting between English and Polish. "I don't understand," I whispered, repeating his name, until his eyes seemed to focus on me, and then he drew a sharp breath and said, quietly but clearly, "Go to the island, Jacob. Here is not safe." It was the old paranoia. I squeezed his hand and assured him that we were fine, and that he was going to be fine. That was twice in one day I'd lied to him. I asked him what happened, what animal had hurt him, but he wasn't listening. "Go to the island," he repeated. "You'll be safe there. Promise me." "I will, I promise." What else could I say? "I thought I could protect you," he said. "I should have told you a long time ago." But I could see the life going out of him. "Told me what?" I said, choking back tears. "There's no time," he whispered. Then he raised his head off the ground, trembling with effort, and breathed into my ear. "Find the bird, in the loop, on the other side of the old man's grave. September 3rd, 1940. I nodded, but he could see it that I did not understand. With the last of his strength, he added, "Emerson, the letter. Tell them what happened, Jacob. I want you to take another one of the stickies, and I want you to mark this page 37, because we're going to see this pop up again and again and again and again until Jacob figures it out. So find the bird, in the loop, the other side of the old man's grave, September 3rd, 1940. Emerson, the letter. Tell them what happened." That's going to pop up at least 5 or 6 more times over the next probably 4 or 5 chapters. With that, he sank back, spent and fading. I told him I loved him, and then he seemed to disappear into himself, his gaze drifting past me to the sky, bristling now with stars. A moment later, Ricky crashed out of the underbrush. He saw the old man limp in my arms and fell back a step. "Oh man, oh Jesus, he said, rubbing his face with his hands, and he babbled about finding a pulse and calling the cops, and "Did you see anything in the woods?" The strangest feeling came over me. I let go of my grandfather's body and stood up, every nerve ending tingling with an instinct I didn't know I had. There was something in the woods, all right. I could feel it. There was no moon and no movement in the underbrush, but our own, and yet somehow I knew just when to raise my flashlight and where to aim it. And for an instant, in that narrow cut of light, I saw a face that seemed to have been transplanted directly from the nightmares of my childhood. It stared back with eyes that swam in dark liquid, furrowed trenches and carbon black flesh loose on its haunched frame. Its mouth hinged open grotesquely so that a mass of long, ear-like tongues could wriggle out. I shouted something, and then it twisted and was gone, shaking the brush and drawing Ricky's attention. He raised his .22 and fired, pat, 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 saying, "What was that? What the hell was that?" But he hadn't seen it, and I couldn't speak to tell him, frozen in place as I was, my dying flashlight flickering over the blank woods. And then I must have blacked out, because he was saying, Jake, hey Ed, are you okay or what? And that's the last thing that I remember. That's the end of chapter 1.